Hi guys, my name is Moira Swanson. I'm here with Conservation Nebraska as an AmeriCorps member. And tonight we have Bob Henrickson with us, and he is going to be talking about native plants here in Nebraska and different different plants you can plant this year. So with that, I will hand things off to Bob.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Moira. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you folks tonight. I see some familiar names there with folks getting in on here. And hi to you, Steve. Thanks for tuning in. Margot, good to see you out there too. Let's see if there's any other names. Oh, Connie, Donna. Good stuff. All right. Well, you guys, I appreciate your time. And let's see, I'm trying to share the screen, Moira. It says host disabled screen sharing. So I need, there we go. Right. Now let's do that. All right, very good. Hopefully you guys can see that plain as day. And basically what we'll do, if you've heard me speak before, you know I run out of time before I run out of plans to talk about. So that'll probably be a case again tonight. So Moira will have access to this PowerPoint so she can share it. If there's information you want to glean from this PowerPoint, please feel free to do so. I'm talking about Nebraska native trees and shrubs tonight. And just know I didn't cover them all. And when we say native, Nebraska natives, that's kind of what I stuck to. I could have talked about, well, we at the statewide arboretum where I work, what we often do is look at it more from a regional sense rather than what is actually native to Nebraska, but what is native to the eastern region, meaning eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, northwestern Missouri, right? Southeastern, southwestern Minnesota, South Dakota. We see it as more of a regional sense when we're looking at native trees because plants didn't draw borders, humans did, right? And so this first picture is a great shot. This is actually on Broad Street in Fremont. So I was cruising down Broad Street and I saw this sign on the side of a bur oak tree and I thought, oh, how cool is that? So I stopped, got out and took a picture of it. So I just thought it kind of said Nebraska, right? Pretty cool. I want to invite you to tune into a gardening talk show I host every Wednesday on KZUM Lincoln. The call numbers are 89.3 FM. However, it's a local radio station. So if you're listening or tuning in here out of Omaha or outside of Lincoln, you're probably not going to be able to get it on the radio. However, you can tune into kzum.org anywhere in the world and listen to the show. They're archived at least for 2 weeks, but love to see you join in every Wednesday, 11 till noon. And as I say, they're dedicated to answering your growing questions. And so I'd love to see you tune into that. How's it growing? Every Wednesday. All right, so let's start off here. And I like to show this shot because it's pretty much anywhere USA, right? Most landscapes, we kind of shove a few plants up by the foundation and call it good because I think we're afraid to kind of go away from the foundation and swallow up at least some of this turf, because what we're looking at here is a food desert, right? For our pollinating insects and other critters. And of course, a golf course. Do you see any blooming plants here? Another food desert. So we're trying to change that where, you know, we're not saying get rid of the whole lawn. Of course, you sure can. That would be great. But at least reduce part of your lawn. So if we all plant a little bit more native plants, then we kind of connect the dots and we can no longer rely on wild places to shore up our nation's biodiversity. We have to do it ourselves in our own home landscapes, and we can. So you may not know that our native woody plants, this is our state tree, the eastern cottonwood. I think this picture was taken near Dannenbrog, Nebraska. Native woody plants supported 14 times as many species as introduced ornamental landscape plants. And that's where the book, Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home, is kind of the the whole gist of his book, but he wasn't looking at perennial plants. He wasn't looking at asters or goldenrods or things like that. He was looking and researching woody plants. So when you hear him talking about that, he was talking about trees and shrubs, which is the backbone of any landscape. And of course, very important in any landscape that we choose native trees and shrubs more often than not. And, you know, and if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to put it in the chat and I'll try to answer those as we go along. So feel free to do that. Okay, and let's see. Yeah, so 90%, we have what's called keystone species, and the keystone species, you know, they're important, and they make up 90% of all the caterpillar species. These are keystone species to support native insects. So in other words, out of all the native plants, a small percentage are making 90% of the caterpillar species. This is another shot of bur oak trees. This is in Dannenbrog, Nebraska. And these are native bur oaks that really dominate this park. And one thing I want you to notice is this is a park full of trees rather than a park full of grass. And my dream is all of Lincoln parks would look like this someday, where we focus on the planting of trees rather than the mowing of grass, because, and I think that one of the reasons we don't do that is people fear that trees take a lot of money to take care of, a lot of time and effort. And I would argue that mowing the grass once a week with a $12,000 mower and an employee that you have to hire to mow that grass is just as costly as having to take care of trees. Another thing I want you to notice is these trees aren't planted 45 foot on center. They planted themselves. They were here before humans showed up. And look at these three bur oaks, literally 4 feet apart, all getting along. So we don't have to plant trees so far apart. So species type and provenance are important factors. And what provenance means is like the native range of that species. Where does that tree occur naturally in the world? And get this, Nebraska, more than any other state in the United States, many tree species meet the limit of their natural range in Nebraska. And I'll show pictures of the natural range of some of these species so you can see what I'm talking about. But this used to be the national champion cottonwood. Unfortunately, it blew down. It's no longer there. This is a tree near Seward. But we do have a national champion cottonwood in Nebraska, just north of Beatrice. And this is a well-known bur oak up at Ponca State Park. They have it core dated. I can't tell you what the age is reading that sign, but bottom line is many tree species end in Nebraska. So, okay, so we've got oaks, the quintessential wildlife tree, the quintessential plant for shoring up biodiversity, and bur oak. Here again, look at this image where 4 stems are right next to each other rather than 45 feet apart. And there again is another shot of the park there in Dannenbrog with the bur oak. Oaks provide valuable nut forage, of course, for a variety of vertebrate wildlife. And a lot of times people think, well, I really don't need any more squirrels. Well, a lot of other critters take advantage of those acorns too, including songbirds, right? And maybe you've witnessed a flock of blackbirds up in your oak tree in the fall and acorns dropping because they're picking them off the tree. They really love pin oaks, for example. So songbirds certainly will eat acorns too. They're not just for squirrels and of course other small rodents as well. But again, notice there's no turf grass under these trees. They just let the leaves drop and don't rake them up and let the leaves become the mulch. Brilliant. So no other plant genus supports more species of Lepidoptera than the oak, and the Lepidoptera are the moths and butterflies. And they're noted for hosting a myriad of leaf miners, dagger moths, hair streaks, inchworms, giant silk moths. Other insects and wildlife also use oaks for shelter and nesting sites. So the way you can make a difference is saying, I'm going to plant an oak, because nothing is better, again, at shoring up our nation's biodiversity than oaks. Restoring large stands of oaks to suburbia would go a long way towards shoring up the future of our nation's biodiversity. So the caterpillars that are feeding on the oak leaves don't pupate in the trees. They fall to the ground when they're fully grown, and then they burrow into the leaf litter, digging themselves into the ground and even chew their way into rotten wood. So you might think you're doing it right, going, well, I've got an oak, I'm doing my part. But if your oak is in a patch of turf grass with hard packed soil around it, tidied up every fall of all those rich leaves, you basically got a food desert. Put in native shrubs, woodland sedges, and or flowers like wild ginger, Solomon seal, woodland phlox. Create landscapes under the canopy of this oak from drip line to drip line. So when the leaves do drop, you're not raking them up and they can become part of the landscape. I do that at my house. And I can tell you, everybody complaining about the drought conditions we have, I can dig under those leaves and my soil is still moist. And I'm also doing it for the long-term health of my oak. This bur oak you're looking at here in this picture is actually in Gering, Nebraska. Gering, kind of Scotts Bluff sister city, way out in the panhandle. You could drive around Gering till you literally every block in town. This is the only sizable bur oak in the whole town. So when I saw this tree, I'm like, man, we should have been planting more of these. And it's literally the only big one in the entire town of Gering. Okay, so we need to mulch less, mulch different for our native bees. Oftentimes when we do big mulching, I guess duties, if you will, they'll put down this weed barrier fabric and then put the mulch over it, right? So to keep the weeds out, right? Well, okay, after a while, this mulch will break down, some dust and dirt will blow in, and the weeds will germinate right on top of that landscape fabric anyway. So you'd end up coming back, either pulling them, or often what happens is people spray them. But we need to mulch a little differently, because 70% of our native bees nest in the ground. And so when it comes to ground nesting bees, access to bare ground is essential. And it's hard for us to kind of live with, well, I have bare ground, no plants, no mulch. Even a 1-inch layer of wood chip mulch can be as impenetrable as pavement to these small bees. So we mulch for many reasons: to suppress weeds, prevent erosion, and because we feel it provides a clean aesthetic. So if you must mulch, consider using compost or shredded leaves instead of wood chip products. These alternatives will have the same weed suppression, water retention, and other properties, yet will be light enough to allow ground nesting bees to pass through. And I've seen that where I let the leaves lay. I haven't raked leaves in the bigger areas of my landscape for years now. And the bird species, especially something like this junco, which are ground feeders, love digging under the leaf mold, which they won't do in wood chips, but they can get under that leaf mold and find, beetles and other insects right under that leaf mulch. And so it's a necessary component in raising a diverse mix of insect species. And if the leaves get too thick for your liking, I will rake off, the top section of leaves, but always leaving a ground layer of maybe 6 inches or so. It's just amazing mulch. And these are the types of bees that were those ground nesters, or even like a minor bee, chewing in soft wood and decaying wood. And of course, that's where we make our bee hotels. So these are the little critters that do the yeoman's work for pollination. And they're the ones that are really struggling out there with our landscapes that we create, right? Because our landscapes, again, are oftentimes food deserts. Oh, great. All right. I see your question there, Daniel. Good stuff. Please do include some information about native plants in the western part of the state. I'll do my best, and I must admit, Daniel, yes, some of the plants we're going to be talking about aren't necessarily native to western Nebraska, but certainly they can be planted in the West, and we'll talk about those for sure as we go along here. So we got a leafcutter bee, mason bee, sweat bee, and our favorite, the bumbling bumblebee, right? Okay, so in early spring, when few if any nectar plants are yet to bloom, bees take fruit from wind-pollinated plants, and you wouldn't think that. The most valuable for the bees are the willow, the poplar, hazels, alders, elm, oak, birch. These are all wind-pollinated plants, like the walnut, the honey locust. They have what's called catkins. And even though they're wind-pollinated, bees will take those take the pollen, collect the pollen to feed their brood early in the spring, because when they're emerging early in the spring, you look around, there's not a whole lot blooming in the landscape except for trees. And oftentimes the flowers of those trees are so small we don't notice them. We just notice the big showy crab apples and things like that, right? But these are the plants that are doing the yeoman's work, are native trees for the pollinators. Okay, and then realize native plants become more than just landscape plants. Most insect herbivores can only eat plants with which they share an evolutionary history. They cannot or will not use exotic or alien plants for food. Other native insects will not be able to survive on alien plant species alone. So if all we do is plant, ornamental trees and trees from literally other continents, which we certainly do, and from, definitely not native to Nebraska, the insects don't feed on those trees. So go figure, we want trees that the insects actually eat on, but these insects aren't defoliating the trees because the trees have natural chemical defenses in the leaves. They'll just take a bite here and there, and you won't really even notice it as you're observing your landscape. So the butterflies or moths, lay their eggs near the caterpillars or on the caterpillar's food source. The caterpillars of some species will only eat a single species. Others will eat a very wide range of plants from numerous families. And of course, one of the most famous is the black swallowtail. Most people plant the parsley and the dill to help grow the black swallowtail, because we know that's what the larvae feed on. So I would challenge you, get to know some of your other butterfly friends and what is their larval food source. Do we know the larval food source for the buckeye butterfly, or the question mark, or the painted lady, or the American fritillary? All these different butterflies, I challenge all of us to learn what are the important plants that they do feed on. And I can tell you, most of those plants they do feed on are trees rather than perennials. So worldwide, 37% of animal species are herbivorous insects. So that means a large percent of the world's fauna depends directly on insects to access the energy stored in plants. Think about the critters us humans eat. From a deer to a cow, we access the energy from that cow, via the plants. And so other critters like birds rely on these insects to feed their young. Indeed, 96% of terrestrial bird species in North America rely on insects to feed their young. They're not feeding their baby birds seeds, right? They're feeding them insects, and most often they're feeding them caterpillars. That's the big one. Oh yeah, Carolyn, I see your question about redbud trees. We will get to redbuds. We'll talk about those. Yes, definitely a redbud tree is a fantastic pollinator and a great native tree that is a good tree to put on your wish list if you don't have one already. So the larval insects that feed on these trees become bird food, right? So if no insects, no baby birds, and indeed no insects, no humans, right? It's just a matter of time. But I don't know if you've ever observed a robin that has literally a dozen worms stuffed into its beak. The pine sawflies that feed on the pine trees that everybody sprays every year because they're worried the pine sawfly is going to kill their pine tree. Well, say they spray that pine tree and then a bird comes and collects the moths that are the caterpillars that haven't died yet, and they're tainted with that herbicide, and then they feed it to their young, and the nest never makes it. So really imperative. And even things like the American kestrel, our little native hawk here, you would think, well, it's a predator. Well, does that look like a baby bird? No, it's a caterpillar. They're soft, they're spongy, they're full of protein. So that's one of the reasons you see that is food choice number one for songbirds feeding their young. And there's some in Doug Tallamy's book, he lists the top 10 trees that he researched that supports the most larval butterflies and moths, and oak is number one, closely followed by willow, the cherries like your wild plum and black cherry, the cottonwoods, your crab apples, the maples like your box elder, elm, hickory, linden, walnut. Those are the top 10 trees, native trees that if you include those in your landscape, anywhere in your landscape, you're doing good work. So the stats on caterpillar consumption are pretty mind-boggling. A single nesting pair of Carolina chickadees will feed their young 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars before fledgling, meaning over 16 days on average. After fledging, nobody has counted, but fledgling chickadees get fed for up to 3 more weeks. And maybe you've observed baby birds that are out of the nest, still whining to mom and dad to feed them because they don't quite have the the knowledge for one, but just, they're not good flyers yet. So mom and dad are still feeding them after they leave the nest. There's no research that shows just how many caterpillars they're feeding them after they fledge. So pretty amazing stats when you consider 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. So if we don't have native trees those caterpillars are feeding on, you can kiss the black-capped chickadee goodbye. And you may know this already, but their numbers are dwindling. All the songbird numbers are down big time. How can we get them back? By planting native trees and shrubs. So yeah, caterpillars are an essential part of the songbird's ability to raise their young. They're relatively large prey items. They're high in protein, high in fat, and of course, they're softs like a sausage with a low percentage of chitin. And what chitin is, can you picture this bluebird feeding its young a beetle, right? So the beetles have, obviously a hard coat and exoskeleton, which is difficult for a baby bird to swallow, you see. So they're also the best source of carotenoids, and vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. They get them from plants or something that did eat plants. Grasshoppers, crickets, katydids are also important prey for raising baby birds. So we need a diverse mix of insects for predators too. And maybe you're one of those peoples where spiders gives you the willies, and whenever you see a spider, your first reaction is to kill it. Just consider spiders eat insects too, and their second most important component of bird food webs. We had a nesting pair of house wrens in a bird house last year at our place, and it was right in our patio, so we could tell what the parents were bringing those babies like daily. And one of the most common things we observed, the wren bringing the babies were spiders, believe it or not. Go figure, huh? So that's pretty cool. So next time you consider killing a spider just because it's a spider, just think of that and leave it alone. Kind of like snakes, leave them alone. So a flower-rich habitat can support bee health. One of the factors thought to contribute to decline and high annual losses of our native bees is the lack of pollen and nectar in the landscape. So again, that food desert. And deficient nutrition can negatively impact the development and survival of bees. Bees reared on multiple sources of pollen have improved immune system function. Go figure. We always talk about diversity is key, and that is certainly the case when it comes to landscaping. Rather than having 10 of the same kind of tree, I say we have one different tree in everywhere you go. Rather than lining the street with the same species, we need to really work on diversifying. So bees reared on multiple sources of pollen have improved immune system function and are better equipped to survive parasitism. So a lot of time with our bee problems, especially the honeybee, is just a lack of diverse diet. So they use native plants that also contain healing essential oils to boost their immune system by feeding pollen to their developing brood and sipping nectar for protection from disease and natural enemies. So by growing ample native plants and herbs, you can promote the good health of bees. That's a cool thing. So now let's talk about some of our native trees in Nebraska. And let's start with conifer trees, probably the easiest one to talk about because we only have 2 native pine species and no native spruce or fir species. Yet you drive around anywhere in Nebraska and we plant a lot of pine trees, right? And most of them are not native, but some are. I'll show you the only 2 that are. They're legitimate choices for the landscape that are native to neighboring states and higher altitudes. In other words, we only have 2 pine species native to Nebraska. However, pine trees like the eastern white pine, which is native to Minnesota, does fine here. We all know that, right? But Minnesota also has the red pine. And then you have over in Colorado, things like the concolor fir, the blue spruce, the white spruce in South Dakota. So we have neighboring states that have conifers that we've done well with. So surprisingly, pine needles provide food for a variety of moth and butterfly larvae as well. So they will lay their eggs on pine trees too, including probably the most famous is the pine sawfly, which again is a you know, they produce copious amounts of that caterpillar, and the birds eat them voraciously as they would any true caterpillar. So try to avoid spraying those pine trees. You're going to help our critters if you do. Okay, so you probably already knew this, but one of our native evergreens, conifers, is the eastern red cedar. Love it or hate it, it's tough as nails tree. It's certainly gotten away in some parts of Nebraska and has become invasive to our prairie plantings, but still kind of the tree you can hang your hat on for windbreaks and things like that around out on acreages. But the eastern red cedar, get this, you guys, the blue fruit that the eastern red cedar produces is regarded as one of the best fruiting trees for songbirds. More species of songbirds eat the fruit of the eastern red cedar than any other native tree. So consider that when you see the blue fruit, and maybe you've observed songbirds eating that blue fruit in the fall. I know robins go crazy for it. And get this, the eastern red cedar fruit has been used by humans for millennia for medicinal purposes. So I think the birds are also getting that same medicine when they eat the fruit. There's another one of our native species. This is the limber pine. And this picture was actually taken from the only known native population of the limber pine in Nebraska. This is out in Kimball County, out in the Panhandle. Beautiful stand of limber pines out there. And we core dated one of the bigger ones. This isn't the tree that we core dated, but we core dated one out there, and it was over 400 years old. So if you're growing out there in Kimball County, you're going to be a mighty slow growing tree. So who knows how old this one is? It could be 150 years old for all I know. There is the native range map of the limber pine. So those green blobs you see on here shows where the native populations of limber pine occurs. So here we are in Colorado, basically mostly along the front range of Colorado. So now they're not typically growing at higher elevations, but more like right on the edge of Denver and Colorado Springs. We got Fort Collins basically going all the way down I-25 here. And here's where it's native to Nebraska, if you see my cursor. So that picture you saw is right there, that little blip right there. So this is what I'm talking about, where man drew borders, plants didn't. So we say the limber pine is native to Nebraska, right? But look at all of the parts of Nebraska it's not native to. Go figure, right? And then a little tiny blip population in the Black Hills. And I'm not sure what this park is up in North Dakota, but you get the idea. The plant is scattered anyway on the Rocky Mountain states, but just makes its way across the border down in Kimball County. Pretty wild, huh? Then we got the ponderosa pine. That's probably Nebraska's most well-known native pine tree. And you recognize it by it has the long needles on it, and the needles that come in bundles of 3. The cone scales have a recurved prickle, so when you pick up the pine cones, it actually has little pokey things. That's one of the ways to tell it apart from say an Austrian pine. An introduced European pine is the Austrian. If you're wondering what you're looking at, pick up one of the cones, and if it pokes you, you likely have the ponderosa, but long needles on the ponderosa. And there you see the native range of the ponderosa pine. Obviously a little more widespread than the limber pine. You can see it's in the Sierras and in California, Cascades up here. And then you get even down into Mexico, the highlands of Mexico, upper elevations. And then as we get towards Nebraska, notice this little line right in here. This is the Pine Ridge of Nebraska. And then here we're kind of following the Niobrara River Valley. And then there's a few little outlier populations of ponderosa here. And then what you're seeing down here, if you can follow my cursor, that is Wildcat Hills, just south of Gering in the Panhandle. And they've core dated the ponderosa pines in the Wildcat Hills, and the bigger ponderosas there are over 400 years old. So the ponderosa, again, although native to Nebraska, it's not native to most of Nebraska, and certainly speaking here from Lincoln, nowhere close to being native to Lincoln, if you look at it from a purist's perspective. Nice picture of the new cones of a ponderosa pine and the candles or the new growth coming out there and the new needles emerging. Love the ponderosa pine. But then here's some of these outliers I was talking about that are not native to Nebraska. However, you saw the map of the limber pine. It's just in the one little stretch out there in Kimball County. Well, look at the red pine. It's actually Minnesota's state tree. So we have it up in here, what, in the Duluth area, then we get in over into Wisconsin and Michigan, and it's basically a Great Lakes type species. But the red pine, really not very well known here in Nebraska. I don't know of a whole lot of nurseries carrying it. There's one nursery that was Nielsen Tree Farm up in my hometown of Dodge, Nebraska, has carried it before. I'm not sure if he still is, but these are some trees growing in a nursery. Fancy looking pine tree, in my opinion. Then you got the Black Hill spruce, which is a pretty popular spruce amongst landscapers and people planting them out on windbreaks and whatnot. The Black Hill spruce is a species of white spruce. And you can see where white spruce, this is the scientific name of white spruce. Look where it's native to. So it's obviously a cold country spruce tree, right? And then you take it down in Nebraska and say, hey, welcome to the heat of our summers. They perform here, but the Black Hill spruce performs better. And here's where the Black Hill spruce came from. So you see, somehow, some way, it got separated from all these other white spruce, little tiny population down there in the Black Hills. That's where the Black Hill spruce seed was collected, and that's where we get it from in the trade. So I think that's pretty interesting, that just one little outlier population. Here's the white pine we all know and love so well. Here you can see its native range. Again, another Great Lakes type species getting into Minnesota and into eastern Iowa. So it's no wonder the tree does so well here in eastern Nebraska. But if you get out to western Nebraska in the panhandle, basically, I want to say west of Lexington, the eastern white pine struggles with the windy conditions and the windswept conditions of the panhandle. They just don't perform nearly as well. In fact, we don't even recommend planting the eastern white pine in the western half of the state. And that's why, because its native range is more from cool country, you see, not necessarily windswept like our prairie situation is. Okay, let's see. Now let's move on to just large trees. And oh, this is a picture of my cohort, Justin Evertson. That is the state champion silver maple down in Chautauqua Park in Beatrice. If you've never been to that park, it's a nice little park to visit. Encourage you to do it. If you're ever in Beatrice sometime, stop in and see that cool park. It's got a lot of history. And okay, so we got to talk about the eastern cottonwood first, right? Nebraska state tree. This is eastern cottonwood. This picture was actually taken here on UNL East Campus. This is right next to the Landscape Services building. This particular cottonwood seems to color up beautifully every fall, so it's very photogenic. So I thought I'd throw that one in there. But this you may not have realized. It's spring. I'm hungry. Remember what I talked about bees emerging early in the spring and there's not much food out there to eat except for our blooming trees. And a lot of times we don't even notice the flowers because they're so tiny or way up in the tree, right? So you don't really see them. But bees emerging from the first warm days of spring gather resins from the cottonwood buds. So this is a cottonwood bud here. You see how it's shiny. And if you touch that really hard, you'll find that it's sticky. And then your fingers are sticky too with that resin that's on there. And they'll collect that resin and mix that with their own enzymes and then use this highly antimicrobial glue to line their hive. And that's what honeybees do. But I know native bees also take advantage of it and will also line the cavity that they're laying a single egg in. We call this thick, sticky glue propolis. And propolis is very important to these insects. And you can see here's a cottonwood bud that's been kind of squeezed and squeezed out. You can see all that resin that's on that person's fingers. And if you smell it, it actually smells rather nice. This is where you maybe have heard of a salve that's been around for centuries called the balm of Gilead. And the balm of Gilead is one of those wonderful antimicrobial, antibacterial resins that people will tincture cottonwood buds and use it as a topical for their skin and for healing things. So it's no wonder the insects collect it. This is a really nice cottonwood growing at in Kearney at Harmon Park. That's another great place to visit. If you haven't visited Harmon Park in Kearney, do yourself a favor and check it out next time you're in Kearney. You'll be glad you did. It's a beautiful park. Has a lot of great stonework in it from a WPA project going back to the 30s, much like the rock work done at Lincoln Sunken Gardens. Harmon Park was done right around the same time to give people employment opportunities during the Great Depression. So Harmon Park, awesome park. And then here is some awesome cottonwoods way out in Crawford, Nebraska. So some beautiful specimens out there in Crawford. Okay, so back to the cottonwood. So cottonwoods really don't get planted much anymore because everybody's afraid that they're going to fall on their house, right? And then another reason is people don't want the cotton in the air clogging up their air conditioner and whatnot, right? So if they plant a cottonwood, usually I want a male cottonwood that doesn't produce the cotton. Well, the problem with that is the male cottonwoods that are available in the trade have been hybridized with another species, and they tend to be wimps. They tend to get a canker disease, and this canker disease that they get doesn't show up until the cottonwood's around 45 feet tall or so. And then all of a sudden you're looking at something that's costly to remove. So the cottonwood, believe it or not, needs to be planted more. Even in our rural areas, it's not planted nearly as much as it used to be. And they're vitally important trees because a myriad of insect larvae or lepidopterans, the moths and butterflies, lay their eggs on cottonwoods as well. Then there's the northern catalpa. Everybody loves the northern catalpa when it's in bloom. A lot of people don't like the northern catalpa because they call it a so-called messy tree. So the catalpa is another one where you see a lot of larger trees in town, but you don't see a lot of young trees. So I'm concerned that down the road, we won't have any catalpas because nobody's replanting them. So we're trying to change that at the statewide arboretum. We've been selling them for years, and it's actually starting to increase a little bit more in popularity. People are planting them again, which is good news. Cottonwoods are awesome, or catalpas are awesome trees, right? Okay, whoops. So monoecious describes a single plant that bears both male and female flowers. With monoecious species, each plant has some flowers with stamens and some flowers with pistils. So this is a monoecious plant or a mono. I've got all my flower parts in one versus a male and female tree like the cottonwood. So a cottonwood is what we describe as a dioecious tree. So just remember the di or di means two, right? So you need two to make a successful pollination. But nothing quite matches the beauty of a catalpa flower up close, right? They look like orchids and a nice sweet smell to them. And these lines you see here, we call those nectar guides. I think humans don't know quite what else to call them. It's like literally a landing pad to let the insect know, hey man, the nectar's down there. So come on in. And you may not know about this, but there's this hawk moth larvae that feeds on catalpas. I saw it one year when we were at Elmwood Park in Omaha. These big caterpillars were all over this catalpa. And I was like, huh, what the heck is that? Well, this hawk moth, here's the moth, the adult, and here's what the larvae looks like. Well, down south in southern states, these caterpillars are very well known as some of the best fish bait out there. So, but again, they've been living together for thousands of years. You can see here's a chewed up leaf here in this catalpa right along here. They may even completely defoliate it, but they hit the tree late enough in the year, it never harms the tree. The tree comes right out of it. So again, if you see this on your catalpa, leave them alone. They're not going to kill the tree. Don't go hire an arborist to go spray them out. Chances are they're kind of a cyclical insect too, where you won't see nearly as many the following year. Yeah, so that large infestations can happen, but unlikely. And so when the leaves sense damage, the production of nectar increases dramatically. And so in other words, the tree can sense that damage and it produces this, excretes a sugary nectar, and that's what ants feed on. So the ants then will protect the catalpa from the larvae feeding on it. They'll basically, bother it until it drops off the tree. This focuses the ants' attention towards leaves that are in need of defense. Pretty cool. So there's the seed pods of a catalpa, and of course the awesome gnarly trunk of an old catalpa too, I think is a sight to behold too. So this is where that so-called messy tree comes in. These hold on all winter and then they drop off in the spring. And if you're in love with your lawn, then you have to try to get those things out of the lawn versus just letting them come up in a mulch bed. Okay, the next tree we're going to talk about is the black cherry. This is an awesome native tree that literally I could drive around Lincoln and count probably on one or two hands the amount of black cherries that are actually planted. It's extraordinarily valuable in nature. You will actually find black cherry native at Indian Cave State Park. I've seen it at Shrubs State Park as well. Those two are probably the main areas where you'll find it, because it doesn't really get any further west naturally than those areas. It's kind of confined along the eastern edge of the state, but certainly hardy in Nebraska. I don't know if I'd plant a black cherry out in Dawes County, but I would certainly try. Heck, we try a lot of other exotic species out there. Why not the black cherry, right? There's the native range of the black cherry. So that slide I showed you guys earlier that says many species of trees meet their range limit in the state, over 30 species. So here's a perfect example. So the black cherry is native to Maine, down to the panhandle of Florida, over to Texas, heck, even down into Mexico. But look at where it stops in Nebraska, right? It just basically follows the Missouri River corridor. And that's it. It doesn't get any further west in the world. What stopped it from getting further west? Well, in geologic time, what stopped it was the prairie, right? It was, for one, it was drier the further west you get, because notice there's none of them in the western states or in these drier locations. It's in eastern Minnesota, but western Minnesota gets drier, much like western Nebraska, right? So that's where it stops along the corridor. So to me, collecting seed and growing trees from that seed collected along this range will give you, in my mind, the best seed source in the world for black cherry, planting those trees further west in our state. So if I'm going to plant a black cherry in Kearney, I want to make sure that seed came from Nebraska. But I can tell you this tree, along with many, many others, probably 99.5% of the trees growing in Lincoln right now or in your hometown didn't come from trees where the seed was collected in Nebraska. That's what's got to change. And if you're concerned about global warming, which you should be, climate change, what are we going to do in the future? Where are our trees going to come from? Where are these tough customers going to come from? I say from our native trees, because again, if we're collecting it on the fringes of its native range, that's the toughest of that species, right? Getting it from the fringe of its native range. I hope that makes sense. So the black cherry, when it's in bloom, basically looks like a choke cherry on steroids. Gets to be a big tree. I mean, a full grown black cherry can be 50, 60 feet tall. Huge tree, gorgeous tree. And native pollinators go crazy for it. They really like it. And it has an attractive flower to boom for us humans. Later on, the fruit forms. And I can tell you, maybe you own a black cherry, maybe you know this already, but when its fruit forms, and the fruit is basically the size of a choke cherry, small little fruits, maybe a third of an inch, quarter inch to a third of an inch, but they're eaten by more than 40 species of birds. and not to mention mammals as well. They will literally, a black cherry in complete fruit, one day, the fruit might completely gone in 4 days. So they just relish the fruit of the black cherry. There you can kind of see the scale for you to show you the size of the fruit. Are they edible? Yes, they certainly are. But much like a choke cherry, you know, you can make a juice out of them. I mean, you've all drinking black cherry soda before, right? It comes from the black cherry. But it also serves as a host for a myriad of butterflies and moths. More than 450 different species will lay their eggs on the black cherry. So again, if you're looking for a native tree besides just an oak or a cottonwood that really does great job attracting beneficial moths and butterflies to lay their eggs, so those critters then feed on the foliage, man, you can't go wrong with a black cherry. It's one of the best. It gets some good fall color, oftentimes kind of a yellowish orange. I've seen reds in them as well, but they have pretty lance shaped leaves as well, kind of shiny and glossy. So consider the black cherry. You'll be glad you did. Okay, now let's move on to the Kentucky coffee tree. One of my favorite trees. It's here's the state champion here in Lincoln. This is right off of I want to say 33rd and P Street area. Great big Kentucky coffee tree back there. And I want you to notice to the left of that trunk, you see this tree that my cursor is following going up here. It's only about less than 10 feet away from the trunk of this big boy. And it kind of branches. You can't see it go out, but it goes out to around 70 feet. That's a pecan. They planted only 10 feet away. And the pecan's saying, hey, I got this. No worries. You can plant me close. I'll find my way. But there you see, here's the native range of the Kentucky coffee tree. And I keep showing you guys this so you can see this pattern, right? So there's the pattern again, the Missouri River corridor. That's where the Kentucky coffee tree grows naturally, natively. And one little blip population, I'd be curious to know where that's at. I'll have to check that out someday. But again, native to quite a few states, not very many, but native to quite a few, but then it stops here in Nebraska. It doesn't get any further west. Now, Kansas obviously gets a little further west in Kansas and in Oklahoma, but you get the idea. It kind of stops at that eastern Missouri River corridor. Okay, and here's where we have the dioecious or plants or dioecious trees, and that describes a group where it has distinct male trees and female trees. So one thing you may not realize, but maybe you're cruising around town and you smell something sweet in the air, and you're like, where's that sweet smell coming from? Well, it might be from the Kentucky coffee tree. You just can't notice the flowers because, I mean, the cluster can be up to 12 inches long, but the flowers are often hidden and lost amid the new foliage. And they're just starting to leaf out now in the landscape. They take their sweet time leafing out in the spring, but maybe you have never seen Kentucky coffee tree flowers before, so I wanted to show those to you. But it's a good example of we can't notice the flowers, but the insects certainly do, and then rely on those for early season nectar and pollen. This is what the coffee tree is probably more known for, those seed pods, which, you know, in the fall start up, or in the summer, more of a chartreuse color, and then turn that kind of brownish black in the fall, drop down and give you a headache because you have to pick them all up. Now, if you're using that as an excuse not to plant one because they're messy, you know, remember how we used to pay kids a penny for each dandelion flower that they bring to us? Well, pay them a penny for each Kentucky coffee tree pod they pick up in your yard, right? then you handle that problem. But I think it's a gorgeous tree. I think this tree is actually out in Alliance, Nebraska. So for you in Dawes County, this would be a fantastic tree for you to plant. Tough as nails, slower growing than it is here in the East, but that slower growth will give you stronger branch angles. They have wonderful architecture in the wintertime against the snow. And then their bark is really gnarly. It kind of looks like stucco has been shaped on the bark. So very tough tree and tough bark. And then you have the American elm. And we're all probably familiar with the plight of the American elm with Dutch elm disease that ravaged the elms in the 60s and 70s. By the end of the 70s, early 80s, most of them are gone. We still have some big old American elms hanging on that have shown resistance to the Dutch elm disease, and some of those elms are in the trade. Princeton is often a American elm you'll see in the trade that has been tested and is proven to be resistant to Dutch elm disease. And you may say, Princeton, why did they give it the name Princeton? Well, there's a line of American elms outside of Princeton University that they collect seed from. That's all they do. So I say we could collect seed from some of these big old boys still growing in Nebraska and still give the American elm a shot because it deserves it. Because again, it's another important native tree that the insects, moths, and butterflies lay their eggs on. And of course, the elms are one of the first trees to flower in the spring, tiny little flowers that you and I don't notice, but again, very important to those emerging bees in the spring. This is an American elm in Omaha, kind of North Omaha area by NP Dodge Park. Beautiful thing, basically canopying the street. So that was the scene. And maybe you're old enough to say, I remember that scene where American elms were planted along the roadsides and they touched canopy to canopy, shrouding the street and shading our streets. And man, we need that back again, right? This is a big old American elm at Holmes Lake here in Lincoln. And what I loved about this tree is somebody didn't come and prune it up so a semi truck can drive underneath it. I thought that was cool. So they actually left the branches hanging down like touching the ground. That's pretty cool. Now, if it was my tree, I would have mulch all the way under here, the heck with that turf grass, so I never had to mow it. I would let the leaves drop, let them create their own mulch, and then that tree is going to be much happier and have a longer existence than just mowing it once a week and compacting that soil with a big bad mower. And then a nice specimen, gorgeous tree. And then in my neighborhood, just a block down from my house, is this big old American elm that's been around probably since the 50s, planted in the 50s. So it survived Dutch elm disease too. So we have these big old elms. Maybe you know of one too in your hometown or your neck of the woods. Important tree that we need to keep around. Okay, now I'll switch gears to the common hackberry. Most everybody knows the hackberry, love them or hate them. A lot of people give the hackberry a bad time. I won't go too much into detail on why. I mean, they're deemed a messy tree, kind of weak wooded. You know, they get hollows in them and then they have to come down, and then it's expensive removing them. But the hackberry is still a very important tree, certainly to the western half of Nebraska. Without the hackberry, a lot of these small towns in the western part of the state wouldn't have a tree to choose from, right? So keep planting hackberries. It's another one of those that we have a lot of larger trees, but not a whole lot of young trees anymore coming along. And if you ever view a hackberry in nature versus a hackberry in a landscape, one of the reasons you'll see, well, I want you to notice these trees closely. You will see what we call no defects. And what a defect is maybe a hollowed out trunk, maybe a crack in the, a crack in the trunk, busted up branches. They're all growing together. And so you don't see any hollow spots forming on here. Why is that? Well, because an arborist never came down to Wilderness Park and pruned large limbs off. If you prune a large limb off of a hackberry, that tree has a hard time covering that wound or sealing that wound off before decay happens. So the decay starts happening before the wound is sealed on these hackberries. That's one of the reasons you get hollowed out trunks, is because too large of branches were pruned away, sometimes necessarily due to storm damage, oftentimes unnecessarily, just because I have a pruning saw and I'm going to prune it because that's what I do. Wabunsee State Park, same thing, no defects on these trees, and they were towering 70, 80 feet tall. Nothing quite compares to the hackberry bark, like that cool ridged warty bark on it. Not all hackberries have that pronounced ridge that you see on it like that, but still rather showy bark to the common hackberry. So hackberry fruit is basically about a third of an inch, right? And you've probably noticed hackberry fruits before, but they have a coating around a hard seed inside. And in fact, it's edible. And I popped them in my mouth before upon a friend's suggestion. He was like, have you ever eaten them? I'm like, no. He pops a few in his mouth right in front of me, just kind of rolled them around his mouth because you can't chew those hard seeds. Well, that fruity outside coating with that crunchy shell just kind of disintegrates around that hard seed. And I kid you not, it tastes a lot like prunes. It was sweet and tasty. Mind you, not much fruit on there, but still, the birds know something we don't know. And what they know, hackberry is high in protein, fat, and other minerals precisely because of the pit. So that little hard seed inside there, in fact, is a long history of nourishing humans. Remains of hackberry fruits have been found in Paleolithic caves. Also, the taste is delicious. The flesh is sweet and fig-like, while the seed is nutty. Look it up, homemade hackberry milk. You'll go, I had no idea. So again, give the hackberry a break when you know how nutritious that fruit is. And that's why so many songbirds, and I've asked Dave Titterington, who is the owner of Wild Bird Habitat Stores here in Lincoln, what does he feel is the quintessential native tree for songbirds? And he said, without a doubt, the hackberry. It's what the most bird species will feed on in the fall when that fruit forms. That's why you see hackberry seedlings probably all over your landscape. It's probably my number one weed in my landscape because I have hackberries coming up all the time from birds planting them when they land and sit up in my oak trees. Even though I don't have a hackberry close by my house, I sure do get a lot of hackberry seedlings. And that's because the birds are planting them after devouring them from somebody else's tree, right? What about the honey locust? The honey locust, another native tree that's often, love it or hate it type of tree. I tend to love honey locusts. The only problem with honey locusts, when they get to be about 50 years old, they'll start declining. You'll get a lot of larger branches dying back and trees slowly but surely declining. And maybe you have a big honey locust, so you're nodding your head in agreement going, yeah, I can relate to that, because when they do get big, you'll get a lot of, smaller branches dropping off every year. But what you may not know is bees collect pollen from trees such as the honey locust, the coffee tree, the oak, the birch, that dangle these catkins. So this is the honey locust flower, and you can see the leaves are just emerging, but oftentimes we don't notice those catkin-like flowers coming down from the honey locust. But it's another one of those where you'll be driving around and you smell something really sweet in the air. Chances are you're smelling a honey locust in flower. You just can't see the flowers from the road, right? And here you can see the tiny little white flowers getting hit by a butterfly and a honeybee. And you see the pollen sac down here where the honeybee is collecting the pollen to bring back to the brood. He's collecting all of that pollen from the honey locust. So again, very important early emerging flower for our bees. Another shot of the honey locust catkins in the spring. Maybe you've never noticed them. Maybe you have. And if you haven't noticed them, look closely and look often, as Dr. John Weaver often said. It gives us an excuse to observe nature more closely, right? There's the state champion honey locust. This is at a house here in Lincoln, near 32nd and Holdridge Streets, as a matter of fact. Big old boy. And I love a honey locust in the fall, man. They don't color up like this every fall, but when they do, it's a sight to behold. And another nice thing about a honey locust is they're not very densely shaded, so we can plant lots of things under them. What we call dappled shade. So the sunlight will penetrate through and keep your shade plants happy. But here's another example of what's going to assure the long-term health of this native tree. and that's getting rid of all this turf grass underneath its canopy, making a meadow type garden or a woodland garden underneath that. So you're never running a mower over that once a week, compacting the soil. Because believe it or not, just your push mower and your footprints mowing that same patch of grass for 40 years once a week is going to compact that soil, plain and simple. So if you convert this lawn to a woodland garden with maybe one path going through it so you can work on it, you're going to eliminate that compaction. You're going to be able to allow all the leaves to drop and remain so you don't have to rake again. Sounds like a pretty good deal to me. Okay, what about the American linden? Most of the lindens that you see around town, in your hometown and here in Lincoln, is what's called the little leaf linden. The little leaf linden comes from Europe. It's a popular landscape tree. For some reason, the American linden kind of fell off of favor with the nursery industry, and really it kind of disappeared for a number of decades. It's starting to make a comeback, but few and far between, because the Japanese beetle loves the European linden. I'm not too sure if they are in love with the American linden and will eat on the American linden as much as the European. But I don't think that's an excuse for us to not plant the American linden. It's an awesome tree. This picture is not going to show it, but the leaves of the American linden, heck, they can be 6 inches across. They're huge leaves. And anyway, the linden flowers have long been known. In fact, one reference will call them the nectar of kings, because the chemicals found in lemon flowers has led to the linden being dubbed the world's best anti-cold, anti-flu herb, period. And what they make that anti-cold and anti-flu medicine out of is the flowers in the form of a tea. So lindens also have long been known as producing great honey. So honeybees go crazy for the linden, and they have amazing quantities of pollen and nectar, not for very long, maybe 3 or 4 days, maybe a week if we're lucky. But if you've ever noticed a linden in full bloom, the insects, the bees are all over it. Butterflies too, but mainly bees. So it's an important tree for our local wildlife, our local insects. So just know if you have a linden, you're doing it right. And if you're considering planting one, you're even doing better. Okay, now the American sycamore, another one of those love it or hate it trees. I love the American sycamore. I think they're awesome. There's some big old sycamores here in Lincoln, Nebraska, maybe in your hometown too. This is actually the state champion outside of Brownville. We were on our way to Indian Cave State Park for a camping trip. And I told my boys we're going to stop and look at this tree, and all they kind of rolled their eyes and said, seriously, do we have to go look at another stupid tree with you, Dad? And I was like, no, this is a special tree. It's a big tree. So we hiked down to it. And the first thing they did was shored themselves up to climb that baby, because it's just, how can you resist, right? Look at that big boy. Pictures don't do it justice of how big this tree is. I think the diameter of the trunk is at least 6 feet apart. That's one of the larger trees in all of Nebraska right there, folks. Gorgeous foliage on American sycamore. Awesome tree. And again, moths and butterflies will lay their eggs and feed on the American sycamore. So it's an important tree from that respect. It's a great tree as a street tree. This is a neighborhood in Omaha, older Omaha area, and lined with American sycamore. And you don't see this a whole lot repeated on streets in Nebraska. I'd like to see a few more streets lined with American sycamore again. But man, that's a neighborhood I'd like to live in because of the trees, right? Oh, let's see. This tree is a big one up in Blair. This is Ralph Steyer Park in Blair. And then this is a big boy in my neighborhood. This is right off of close to Union College and Calvert Elementary. One of the biggest sycamores I know of in Lincoln. Awesome tree, huh? Nothing quite matters that or comes close to the camouflage bark of an American sycamore, especially the almost a bone white on tops of the trees, highlighting the trees in the dead of winter. One of my faves. And there you see the native range of American sycamore. Again, rinse and repeat, right? We've seen this pattern before, right? See where it stops? Right along the Missouri. Go figure. And then in Kansas, maybe ventures out a little bit west, but here you start to see the Flint Hills of Kansas. Kind of, again, that's a prairie zone. And then, of course, western Nebraska, western Kansas. The tree says, nope, too dry for me to want to grow there naturally. But again, you see that original slide where I showed you many native tree species in Nebraska meet the limit of their natural range in our state. So there again, you out in Dawes County, anybody like maybe you're in Oshkosh, maybe you're in Ogallala, maybe you're in Lexington, you can see why something like an American sycamore would struggle in your neck of the woods, right? Because although it's native to Nebraska, it's native to 3 or 4 counties, and even those 3 or 4 counties, it's right on the edge of that county. Does that mean you can't grow sycamore out there? No, you can certainly try, but it's a stretch. And then there's the seed balls that you're probably familiar with the sycamore. Oh, and then there's the lowly silver maple. The poor silver maple gets a bad rap too, but I want you to look at this tree closely. You see the nice trunk, you see all these branches coming away. This tree was never pruned by an arborist. I don't see any defects on this tree. Oftentimes, when we prune silver maples, they would take this large branch off. Why would they take it off? I have no idea, but let's say they do. They remove this large branch right here. Now you have a big open wound. The tree tries to seal that wound, and it can't seal the wound in time before decay starts taking place back in there. So oftentimes you'll see hollowed out trunks of silver maples. Look closely at that silver maple. Why does it have a hollowed out trunk? You can probably spot an old pruning cut where a large branch was removed in the past. The healthiest silver maples I see are the ones I see in nature, and they typically have no defects on them because humans haven't come along and pruned them. Go figure. So give the silver maple a break. I know it's one of those love it or hate it trees, and most people hate silver maples. I, for one, love silver maples. I think if I bought an acreage and I was like, what's the first tree I could plant? I guarantee you one of them would be a silver maple, because it's a fast growing tree. I would just be smart enough to say, I'm not going to plant it, 20 feet from my house, right? It's going to be, kind of a distance away from my house, so I don't have to worry about, a weak wooded tree, a so-called weak wooded tree falling on my house. That being said, I've observed plenty of silver maples in nature, growing naturally in nature with big windstorms, and I don't see any damage on those trees because they're protecting each other, planted in groups, each tree protecting the other. But what you may not realize, one thing you do know is they produce an abundant amount of seed. This year, no exception, right? If you have a silver maple, holy moly, did they produce a big seed crop this year? And those seeds are eaten by many birds, the evening grosbeak, finches, wild turkeys, small mammals. Maybe you even observed squirrels eating the seeds of silver maple. I certainly have. And it's another one of those that blooms very early in the spring. Oftentimes we look up at the tree and we say, oh, the buds are swelling. Well, actually what you're observing are the flowers. It's just too far away to be able to tell it's actually a flower. But this little bee knows it's in bloom. And again, it becomes a very important nectar pollen source for emerging bees when they're just waking up from their winter slumber, when there's few other things in bloom in the landscape other than these types of trees. Okay, now let's talk about the hickories. I'm a big fan of the hickory trees. I think they're overlooked and underutilized. Awesome tree. You will find the hickories native again. It's that repeated pattern right along the Missouri River corridor. And the shagbark, known for this shaggy exfoliating bark, is what gives them away from their appearance. and they often have great fall color, nice yellow to them with the fall color. What's interesting in this picture, this is on UNL East Campus, and the tree here on the right was from seed collected in Ohio. And you can see it's growing a little bit faster. These two trees were planted the same day. This was a Nebraska seed source, and notice the difference in fall color. The Nebraska one is more, and it's a horrible picture, kind of pixelated and whatnot, but the image doesn't capture what I was seeing that day. This thing was beautiful, golden yellow, and the shagbark hickory next to it was just kind of dirty brown. So that's the difference in seed source right there, just with fall color. They have some cool catkins in the spring. And remember, I told you about catkins, although this is a wind pollinated flower. The bees, small bees will still feed on this pollen and collect pollen from the shagbark hickory. Long, cool catkins. I hear red described as like tinsel hanging from the tree. I would agree, it looks like tinsel. There again, nice fall color, and the foliage is gorgeous in the summertime. You can see it's thick and leathery and kind of glossy looking, and just gorgeous foliage in my opinion. And there's the fruit of a shagbark hickory developing. They come in like, you can see that line right here. They come in like these four distinct parts of that husk, that when the seed ripens, those husks split apart and the seed comes out. So there you see the inside of the husk. There's the nut within that husk. So this husk is basically very woody, and the tree has to produce a lot of energy just to grow this. So the hickory, like a lot of our native tree species, will have heavy seed crops some years and not so heavy seed crops in the subsequent years. And there's various reasons humans think this takes place. I think it's mainly because it takes a whole lot of energy to produce a big seed crop. So the tree better not produce a seed crop that big every year, or it's going to expend all of its energy, if that makes sense. And then our other native hickory tree to Nebraska is one of my all-time favorite shade trees. If you're considering planting any native shade tree, please let it be the bitternut hickory. Not as easy to find. Thankfully, we have growers in the state now that are making it a point to make the bitternut hickory available. I'll give a shout out to my friends at Great Plains Nursery. Basically, Great Plains is about the only nursery you'll find it at, other than Nebraska Statewide Arboretum. We've certainly grow and sell the trees as well. But my, oh my, what an awesome tree, in my opinion. Relatively fast growing. I planted one at home in 2011, a little tiny 2 to 3 foot high tree, and it's around 30 feet tall, 13 years later. So you may say, well, I thought hickories were slow growing. Try telling that to my tree. It's kicking butt. Okay, so there's the fruit of a bitternut hickory. The shagbark that I showed you earlier, that fruit is around, maybe a couple inches across at the most. A bitternut hickory is around 3/4 of an inch, maybe 1 inch at the most. And you can tell a bitternut hickory, it has what we call the dormant buds here on the stem, or what we call naked buds, rather than a bud that has a scale on it. And so bitternut hickory is the only one we know of that has these sulfur yellow scales on that naked bud. They get great golden yellow fall color. There's a tree at Indian Cave State Park. That's where you'll find a boatload of bitternut hickories native, but we also have them native in Wilderness Park. This is the largest one I know of in Wilderness Park here in Lincoln. And get this, if you make it a point to say, well, I'm going to go to Wilderness Park and try to find these bitternut hickories, they're not all over the park, but there's definitely, I tried to, observe them and count them one year, and I think I counted something like 70 trees and said, okay, there's more here than I thought, so I quit counting. But either way, what's cool about this, I think I have it on the map. Before I get to that though, quick picture here of the largest tree that was growing on O Street in Lincoln. And notice I say was, this house was tore down. They took the tree with it. And now the tree is gone. It's really sad because it was an awesome tree. Again, you could be down at 9th and O Street in Lincoln and be able to see that tree near 27th and O, all the way up the street. But it's no more, it's gone, history. There's the native range of the bitternut hickory. And remember I said there's a population at Wilderness Park. That's pretty much Lincoln right in this area, right? So you can see where that population is in Wilderness Park. It doesn't get any further west in the world. I think that's pretty cool. We have collected seed from the trees in Wilderness Park. We have grown those trees from seed, and we have dispersed those to the people. So consider a bitternut hickory. You'll be glad you did. There's the state champion. I think that tree is still with us. There were two trees similar in size. I know one of these trees died, and I have a feeling I know why it died. You probably have an idea too. The tree was here before the road was put in. So when they put in the road, they probably severed half of that tree's root system. So it took many, many decades for that tree to finally die, but it did. And here's some of my friends that usually come along with me to collect seed down in southeastern Nebraska. So we go down there in Richardson County, Nemaha County, because again, I showed you pictures of all the native species that meet their western limit in those areas. So that's where we go to collect the best of the best. And this is the fellow that takes care of the cemetery here. This is Wyuka Cemetery in Nebraska City. Maybe you haven't been there. If you haven't, consider going there. Next time you're in Nebraska City, find Wyuka Cemetery and do a drive-through. And you're like, why? Why go to cemetery? Well, that's where J. Sterling Morton is buried. So make it a pilgrimage to find out the founder of Arbor Day. His gravesite is there in this park. I don't think I have a picture of it, but still, it's worth looking for and finding. The Wyuka Cemetery in Neb City. Okay, now another, should I say, the lowly black walnut, because the black walnut gets a bad rap from people. That whole thing with juglone. Don't walnut trees prevent other plants from growing? Don't they kill other plants? Why, yes, they can. But do you see how horrible the turf grass is doing under this black walnut? That was a joke. The turf grass is doing just fine under this black walnut, right? So that juglone thing, that chemical, that allelopathic chemical that the walnut produces is largely overblown, in my opinion. And here you see the flowers of a black walnut. Again, those are catkins, just like we saw on the hickory, just like we saw on the honey locust, just like we see on the cottonwood, just like we see on the birch trees. So a lot of tree species use the catkins as their flower, wind pollinated versus relying on bees. I think black walnuts are awesome. I think they're pretty trees. I think they're overlooked and underutilized. Okay. Oh, and walnuts are important trees for local wildlife. Go figure, right? Now you may be thinking all we need is more squirrels, right? No, the foliage hosts a myriad of Lepidoptera. Again, Lepidopterans are moths and butterflies. And of course, the large nuts help sustain squirrels and other rodents, which are important to all the foxes that are making their home in Lincoln, right? So walnuts produce juglone, and that's a chemical that can stunt growth or even kill other plants. What is the most susceptible to juglone? Plants in the nightshade family. Apparently, some people study this. The nightshade family is things like peppers, tomatoes, eggplant. Last time I checked, we're not planting vegetable gardens underneath our black walnuts. So you're not planting your vegetable garden underneath any tree. So again, juglone, widely overblown. Most native species, that means native woodland plants, wildflowers, grasses, shrubs, those natives that evolved within the range of walnuts are unfazed by juglone. So consider that. There's a close-up of the catkin flowers on a walnut. And of course, we all know what the black walnut fruit looks like, right? Hanging on the trees. They can get some great fall color on them as well. Depends on the year, not every year, but in a good year, you'll see some beautiful fall color. And then this is the state champion black walnut at Arbor Lodge. Next time you go to Nebraska City and maybe visit Arbor Lodge, they have a loop trail. So the lodge is basically directly north of this big tree, and it's labeled. And I think they even have a plaque in front of it now that recognizes it as Nebraska's largest black walnut, until somebody finds one bigger. And then I want you to notice this beautiful black walnut in Omaha, in the heart of Omaha. And you see all these dead plants underneath that black walnut. They're just like can't survive that juglone, right? Yeah, you're saying, no, those aren't dead. No, they're perfectly happy. So get that juglone thing out of your brain. It's overblown, period. Okay, oaks, the quintessential wildlife plant. We'll talk about oaks in Nebraska now, including this one, the bur oak. And the bur oak doesn't get planted nearly enough in our state. A lot of times the excuse is they're too slow growing and they're too big. They get way too big. Well, if I live in this house, man, I want the shade from that bur oak. And as one person said, what's up there but sky anyway, right? So who cares how big it gets? Just don't plant it next to a power line, right? But notice the multi-stemmed of that oak. Nice specimen. It's also called mossy cup oak because of the fringed cap of that acorn. The only known block I know of in all of Nebraska, and please put it in the chat if you know of another. I don't know of one block in the entire city of Lincoln. Well, this is the only block in the entire city of Lincoln. I don't know of a block in the entire city of Omaha, Kearney, Grand Island, Valentine, Lexington, you name the town. There's not a block that's been dedicated to just bur oak. That kind of blows my mind. The only block I know of is here on UNLE's campus, literally from where I'm speaking, a block from me right now. But what a winter scene right there, huh? Wouldn't it have been cool if we would have planted more than just one line, one block of just bur oak? It'd be awesome. I think we can still do that. Let's do that. How about it? Awesome tree with that cool ridged bark, gnarly bark, thick bark that was able to withstand prairie fire, so the prairie would blow right through. The prairie fire would blow right through and not harm this tree because of that thick bark. So it became very fire resistant because of that. And then the bur oak with its classic leaf shape, really unlike any other oak. Here you see the native range of a bur oak. And you can see this one said, I'm going to venture a little further west than some of those other wimps. So it kind of is more native along waterways and rivers and streams as it's moving to central Nebraska. But if you look at this little dot right there, we call that Bur Oak Canyon. And Bur Oak Canyon is a little outlier population of bur oaks near McCook and Culbertson, Nebraska. And we have collected seed from that. Indeed, that Great Plains nursery I was telling you about, check them out. They actually sell seedlings of black or bur oak collected from Bur Oak Canyon, and they call it relic bur oak. Pretty cool tree. And again, I like to show these pictures that show that these trees didn't pay attention to spacing. What you're probably seeing here is this tree way back in the day was cut down for lumber or logged. And then this is the resprouting taking place from where that tree was cut down. Often they come back and 1, 2, 3, or 4 stems, so multi-stemmed when they're resuckering back. But you can see the bur oak, again, is native from Ontario all the way down to the Gulf, and then it gets up into the Great Lakes region. So it's really got a wide swath of native range. But again, in Nebraska, kind of only going halfway through the state. This one you may not know, though. This is a relatively overlooked and underutilized oak in Nebraska. Well, it's not relatively, it is overlooked and underutilized. What I love about the black oak, you might be looking at saying, well, it just looks like a red oak to me, Bob. It is in the red oak family, but black oak differs from red oak in that the leaves, the picture doesn't do it justice. They're lustrous and shiny. And if you rub the leaf or touch it, it feels very leathery to the touch. Thick, so that thick leathery leaf and that shininess helps in its drought tolerance. So you'll often see a black oak growing up on top of the hill, and its cousin, the red oak, more at the bottom of the hill, because the red oaks likes a little more moisture. This one says, bring on dry conditions. I love dry conditions. So a tough tree, harder to find in the trade. About the only one I know that you're going to be able to get it from is, again, Great Plains Nursery or the Nebraska State White Arboretum. I don't know of another source in Nebraska that sells this tree, which is pretty sad. Okay, again, rinse and repeat. There's the black oak native range following the Missouri River corridor. Gorgeous leaves. This is a tree. This is Indian Cave State Park. I mean, if you ever go to Indian Cave in the fall to admire the fall colors, the oak you're seeing color up at Indian Cave, what you're probably seeing is the black oak. This is a good example showing that the soil has kind of all eroded away. Just seeing how deep. I mean, here's the original line, the trunk line. Well, this soil all eroded away, so you can see how deep those roots go. Pretty impressive. So you can see why they're so darn drought tolerant. They go down looking for moisture. When they're emerging in the spring, the new little leaves are quite showy, cast with this reddish tint. And then the catkin flowers, remember we keep talking about catkin flowers, with the emerging leaves, it's very showy on this tree, even from a distance. And I like to collect the leaves when they're small like this, and then I'll press those leaves for pressed leaf arrangements, because it's a nice miniaturized version of that leaf, only about 1 inch long versus, you know, trying to make a pressed leaf specimen out of something like that. Then you need a big frame, right? So pressed leaf specimen using these little guys, it's fun to do. So I encourage you to do that. Press some tree leaves as they're emerging in the spring. And then the acorn of a black oak as well is small and definitely not messy. It basically disappear in the lawn. Not a tree to be concerned about for mess. But then its cousin, the red oak, is distinguished. You see these acorns here. These acorns are around 1 inch long and 1 inch wide, whereas on a black oak, they're more like, 1/2 inch at the best. So that is one of the distinguishing features between the two. Otherwise, the leaves look very similar. They tend to be a little larger on the red oak, not quite as glossy as the black oak. And then the bark is smoother, often forms these diamond-shaped pattern and these ridges on it, whereas the black oak is kind of an alligator back type bark, I guess. And of course, the red oak can get some awesome fall color on it. And there you see the native range of red oak. Rinse and repeat right along the Missouri corridor. And I'm sure this little blip you're seeing in Kansas, I think this might be the Republican River as it comes up. And so it's certainly a waterway where the tree was following that waterway to the west. Be a nice seed source to collect from right in there. And what I mean by collecting from here, then if we collect red oak from Nebraska rather than Pennsylvania or New York, well, then that red oak is going to stand a much better chance performing in Kearney, performing in Valentine, performing in North Platte, right? But again, I guarantee you 99.9% of the red oaks growing in the landscape right now never came from Nebraska. We can change that. And Great Plains Nursery is. There's our state champion, red oak, right off of East Campus. This is around, I want to say, let's say 35th and Star Street, something like that, or Orchard in that area, just about a block south of Holdred Street here in Lincoln. And that picture doesn't do it justice. It's a huge tree, impressive specimen. And then one of our other native oaks, and this one is native. However, it's a tiny little population down in Richardson County. But what's unique about the blackjack oak is its leaves, that kind of spathe-shaped leaf. No other tree really has a leaf shaped like that. You kind of have to squint your eyes saying, really, that's an oak? Yeah, blackjack oak, cool oak, more native to Kansas and Oklahoma, into Missouri, but definitely a tree we can be growing here. This is a picture of a tree. This is along Fremont Street here in Lincoln near 50th and Fremont. How do I have all these darn things in my brain? Oh, I'm weird. I remember where I take pictures from. So I was here at this tree around 50th and Fremont, and it had seed on it. So I knocked on the door here and said, hey, this may sound weird, but do you mind if I collect acorns from your tree? And sure, go right ahead. So I had my step ladder. I'm up there plucking off acorns off this tree, and I knew the owner would come out and say, hey, can you tell me what kind of tree that is anyway? I've always wondered what it was. So I told her what it was, and she's like, oh, okay, cool. I said, just know you've got a pretty unique tree here in Lincoln. We could drive around the whole dang city and not see another blackjack oak. But as you can see, it's doing well right there as a street tree in Lincoln, Nebraska. There's the bark of it. Attractive tree. There is the native range of the blackjack oak, and they don't even show, there's a little tiny, oh, they don't even show it as a dot like this dot over here. They should have a dot right there that shows a tiny little population just into Nebraska. But again, close enough, eastern Kansas, eastern Oklahoma, most of the state of Missouri, we can certainly grow blackjack oak in Nebraska, and it's perfectly hardy for us to do that. And then finally, the white oak we have 7 oaks native to Nebraska. So I showed you, this is the last of them, the white oak. And the white oak, again, is native to Nebraska, but a very small population down on the Richardson-Nemaha County line. That actually a small little population that's in peril due to herbicide use. The oaks are very susceptible to that. And visiting that population down in Richardson County, the leaves are all curled every year. I think it's just a matter of time before those herbicides are going to kill those white oaks. So we have actually seedlings right now growing here in our shade house, and I'm going to make sure we get those seedlings planted somewhere where they're a little more protected, so we save the genetic makeup of that seed, because again, it's the western fringes of that of the white oak. And I think the best seed source in the world right here in Nebraska. They get some awesome fall color on them, some more flat platy bark, almost whitish bark, hence the name white oak is where it comes from. There's some nice specimens of white oak. This tree right here is our state champion. This is Antelope Park. So if you enter Antelope Park in Lincoln off of A Street, and you take that curved around, the Antelope Park band shell is right over this away to the left. But this is the largest white oak in Nebraska, an awesome kind of a Robert Frost type oak, and great place for a picnic. Amazing tree right here in Lincoln, Nebraska. Again, I get some awesome fall color on it, and some really pretty acorns, in my opinion. Oh, okay, I thought it was the last oak. We got 2 more. Okay, one more oak is the chinkapin oak, and a fantastic native species. This tree never used to get planted at all. It's starting to get planted more and more, certainly in Lincoln. And wherever it's getting planted, this tree is really performing, doing quite well as a street tree, as a neighborhood tree. Gorgeous foliage. Again, you can see it's lustrous and shiny and leathery. And whenever you have a tree that has lustrous, shiny, thick, leathery type leaves, that's an indicator that that tree is very drought tolerant, because it holds in moisture easier than a tree that has papery leaves. This is a big old chinkapin oak. Look at the bark, completely different than, say, a bur oak, right? Or some of the other oaks I was showing you, very flat and platy. And this is actually a tree in the left at Wabaunsee State Park, just across the river in Iowa. And then this is a chinkapin oak down at Indian Cave State Park. And there again, you see the native range just makes it into the southeastern corner of the state. Little blip of a population down here, this area down here, and I was shown by a tree nerd friend, this is near Wymore and Barnston. And we have collected acorns from those trees growing down there too, because again, it's on the fringes of its natural range, making our seed the best seed in the world, in my opinion, for chinkapin oak. Now, Texas would probably disagree, but I'm not planting trees in Texas. I'm planting them in Nebraska. So I think this seed source could be taken into South Dakota. This seed source could be taken into Wyoming. This seed source could be taken into the Front Range. That's what I'm talking about. So the chinkapin oak has a cousin, and the cousin is called dwarf chinkapin oak. It's unique, and in fact, it's a rare tree in nature. It's native to 16 states, but listed as imperiled in 8 of them, meaning this tree is native to those states, but it's very small outlier populations. It's not all over the place. And it's not all over the place in Nebraska too. You really only find it in 2 counties, down in Richardson and Nemaha. So it's a very shrubby oak, and it's small, as you can see, not even as tall as me, but over time, it will get to be around 20 to 25 feet tall, often multi-stemmed. But look at that foliage, shiny, lustrous, thick, leathery, extremely drought tolerant. If you look closely in at the kind of the base of those are the tiny little acorns that are forming in clusters on this tree. It is one of the one oak that produces acorns at the youngest of age. We have seen acorns form on this tree on only 3-year-old trees. So it's a great tree for wildlife. The emerging foliage in the spring is awesome. The catkins in the spring are very showy. Probably the showiest of all the oak catkins, but they're again showing off the beautiful lustrous foliage. And look at all those acorns. Just that one cluster right there is going to have what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a cluster of 6 or 7 acorns right there. And there you see the acorns when they're fully developed in the fall. Nice foliage again. And there we are collecting seed from dwarf chinkapin oak down near Salem, Nebraska. Salem, if you don't know where that's at, it's just west of, south and west of Falls City, down in Richardson County, the far corner of the state. This is the largest known population of dwarf chinkapin oak in the world. And I've been told that by oak experts. So we go down there, this landowner lets us on his property, and we collect acorns from that every year. I've gotten acorns from this plant to a nursery, Reeseville Ridge Nursery in Wisconsin. I've gotten it to a nursery down in Missouri, to a nursery down in Louisiana, trying to get that tree out all over the place because, again, I think it's the best seed source of this species in the world. Tough as nails, awesome tree. Yeah, there you see the native range. So in Nebraska and Kansas, these are, just right on the edge of the border. And these ones down in Kansas, I don't even know, it's just small little tiny populations or whatever, but no matter where you see it, they're small little populations. So just for posterity, this tree should be planted to save it from literally extinction. Okay, let me check the time here. Let's see. I think we are out of time, right? Moira, I think we're out of time, aren't we? Uh-oh. I think I was supposed to go till 8.
That's okay. It's all really good information. So it's
Yeah.
always great to learn more. We do have a quick poll before we do some Q&A, so I'll send that to everyone's screen. If you could take just a few minutes. It's only 4 questions. It takes about 30 seconds to answer them. If you could all answer the poll that will pop up on your screen, that would be great. And then while we're doing that, I will start the Q&A chat. So someone said, good stuff. Please do include some information about native plants in the western part of the state. I am in Dawes County.
Yeah, Daniel, hopefully I answered some of those questions for you. I didn't, obviously talk about each tree doing well for you out there, but I did mention some. The bur oak is like number 1 out in Dawes County, in my opinion. That dwarf chinkapin oak we have planted as far west as Kimball County, and it's not skipping a beat in Kimball County. In fact, a person up in North Dakota said they have planted dwarf chinkapin oak in western North Dakota. He said it's hardy to -45 ambient. So incredibly tough tree, even doing well in western North Dakota. So I would love to see more of them planted out in your neck of the woods, Daniel. And the Kentucky coffee tree, the black walnut, the catalpa. A lot of those trees that we went through will do well for you out in Dawes County.
Okay, thank you. And then, like I said before, the Q&A is open, so please ask questions that you have. Daniel said, great, thank you.
Oh yeah, and Steve,
Um,
yeah, the hackberry, of course, yeah, the hackberry out west, no doubt. Yeah, and Carolyn, the redbud trees, unfortunately, I'm all talk and no action. So you see where I left off here, medium-sized trees. The redbud was going to be in there. There's so many trees to talk about. It's not even funny, but yeah, redbud trees are native to Nebraska. And it's another one, you guys, that same map I keep showing you. The redbud tree is almost the same pattern right along the Missouri River corridor. It doesn't get any further west than that. You can see it native at places like Indian Cave State Park and Wabunsee State Park in the spring. Awesome tree.
and then just a reminder, if you haven't taken the poll yet, please answer the poll questions. This is how we maintain funding for events like this, so it would be really recommended that you take the poll. We have something in the chat.
Oh, I see Connie asking any fruit trees that you recommend for South Central Nebraska. Now, I'm assuming, Connie, we're not talking about apples and pears and cherries, right? You're probably talking about native fruit trees, right? For South Central Nebraska. Yeah. Yeah, the fruit trees, I would say for South Central, man, your quintessential would be that black cherry. I'd love to see you plant a black cherry. Maybe you're in the Minden area or you south of Kearney or somewhere in that area. I'm pretty darn confident Black Grand Island. Okay. Yeah. I bet you could cruise around Black Grand Island and not find a single black cherry planted in town, right? So you could be the first one that says, I have a black cherry. That would be number one. You know, maybe another fruit tree you've heard of from Nebraska is the pawpaw and the persimmon. The pawpaw and persimmon, man, they would be a stretch in Grand Island, I'm afraid. Would it stop me from planting them? Heck no. I think we're not going to know unless we do plant them. So I would love to see you plant persimmon and pawpaw in Grand Island and see how they do. Just know it'd be kind of a test tree for you because we don't have a whole lot of history of those native fruit trees being planted there. If I'm you, I'm thinking more about our fruiting shrubs. You know, the big three, the wild plum, the chokecherry, and the elderberry. We all need to plant them more because they're being removed from our roadsides. They're being removed from farmsteads because we're farming from ditch to ditch, right? So even the chokecherry, the wild plum, and the elderberry are in trouble. So we need to plant those as our fruiting shrubs, if you will. But yeah, other than the black cherry, pawpaw, persimmon, oh gosh, Steve, help me out. I'm kind of drawing a blank out. Obviously, the hackberry is a fruiting tree. It just depends on how you describe fruit, right? If you're describing any old fruit, the hackberry is going to do, right? But if you're saying, I want a fruit tree that I can collect and eat from, that's why I'm mentioning those others to you. So hopefully that answers your question at least a little bit. Oh yeah, serviceberry, duh. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, serviceberry would definitely do well in the Grand Island area. I've seen serviceberry planted in North Platte doing well. Yeah, Connie, that serviceberry, man, put that on your wish list. You got to have it. There's a serviceberry that gets more tree form that you can find in the trade. It's called apple serviceberry, not quite native to Nebraska, but close enough. What you'll find with the apple serviceberry is one called Autumn Brilliance. It's a good tree form serviceberry. Otherwise, put on your wish list, look it up online, Connie. Look up the shadblow. That's SH shadblow serviceberry. Shadblow is kind of a smaller tree, maybe 15, maybe 20 feet. If you have a really nice shadblow, it'll get to be around 20 feet. But that's a nice multi-stem small tree, awesome for its fruit. If you can beat the birds, oftentimes the birds will take it before it's ready for you to eat. Okay, let's see, did we get them all? You know, Carolyn, more thing about the redbud trees, you had asked, yes, they bloom very early. Pollinators are definitely attracted to them, and the foliage as well is the larval food source for a number of moths and butterflies too. And then the redbud produces those little bean pods. And then later on, those bean pods turn brown, right? That you've seen on those trees. Inside those pods are usually 3 to 4 to 5 seeds. And those seeds are chocolate, they're like 40% protein. So if you have a red bud and the birds are eating them and kind of pooping the seeds all over the place, there's a reason they are. Well, that's because they're chock full of protein. So that's why you'll see the birds go crazy for red bud trees in the fall.
And then we have a question from Kate. I had to cut down an elm a few years ago due to Dutch elm disease. Now I have to cut down 2 more this year. How long should I wait before planting new trees?
Well, because Dutch elm is associated with elm trees. Now, I'm assuming if you mean another elm, man, I don't know. If it's like residual in the soil, that's a good question. I don't know that specific answer, but just know that if you choose something besides an American elm, you can plant anytime, because that Dutch elm disease is just associated with elms. It's not associated with oaks. It's not associated with hackberries. It's not associated with lindens or walnuts or anything like that. So you're perfectly fine. It's too bad the Dutch elm finally got your trees. That's too bad, darn it, because yeah, it's a big loss, but just know you don't have to worry about planting any other species, catalpa, on and on. But if you're doing an elm, I would do a little more research on that. Unfortunately, I can't answer your question about, how long do we delay before we plant a new elm?
And then Daniel asked, will a recording of this presentation and the slides be available? I would like to show this to someone. And yes, it will. You can reach out to Conservation Nebraska and we can get you the slides. Otherwise, a recording will be posted to our YouTube channel later on. Usually that takes about 2 to 3 weeks to get posted up on there. So
Yeah.
keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Daniel. And Moira, last time, as you know, my PowerPoints are very big. We'll probably have to do it like we did last time, right? Where we hook up and I get the flash drive when you download it like that. Because you guys, this medium-sized trees you see here, this is going to include things like the redbud, like the pawpaw, like the serviceberry, like the quaking aspen, like the paper birch. So there's lots of trees on this medium-sized tree. So the PowerPoint, will provide you a much bigger list than what I had time for this evening.
And then Kate messaged in the chat. She said, thank you. I am looking at non-elm options.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Where did Kate say she was from again?
Let me check.
Omaha. Okay. Yeah, Kate. Yeah, you got tons of options, man. If you would have been in Lexington, been a little more limited, but any of the trees that you heard me talk about today, and if you get this PowerPoint that Moira is going to make available to you guys, just give us a few days, you guys, because we're both busy. So to get that, in Moira's hands is, going to take probably until next week before we're able to get that done. But you'll have lots of, maybe you have large trees already, Kate, in your area, and you don't have room for large trees. So you could look to these medium-sized trees for options. But any of those large trees I showed you in those, literally, you're not limited to any one of those. You could plant, from the sycamore to the oaks to the hackberries to, on and on, the black cherry. None of those species would you not be able to plant.
And then Willa asked, can the YouTube link be posted to Facebook groups like Nebraska Gardening Tips, Hints, Share, and Trade? We don't specifically post them on different Facebook groups, but you are more than welcome to share them to different Facebook groups. That would be awesome.
Cool.
And then will you be doing one of these on shrubs, doing some landscaping soon? And wanted to put friendly options in. I am in
Right.
Papillion.
Yeah, that's funny. Both Donna and Desiree, I feel bad, you guys, because I'm all talk, no action here. And, there's so many trees to talk about. And I knew, I probably wasn't going to get done because you're right. I would love to do another presentation on medium-sized trees at a later time. And I'm pretty sure I could get shrubs in that same talk because I know I was supposed to be talking about those tonight. So I apologize I didn't get to those, but Moira, we can work out a time and say, okay, and maybe it's over the summer, if neither one of our schedules line up, for sure, we'd be able to do it over the winter months, right, Moira, if we can't get it done yet this summer or fall, I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure. We definitely could do something.
And then
It'll-
Daniel asked the best way to reach out for the PowerPoint.
You can just email me and it's just mswanson@neconserve.org. And I can get you the PowerPoint. And if you can't get a hold of, if for some reason it doesn't work, you can always reach out to our general box at Conservation Nebraska, which is on our website.
And speaking for me, if I'm Daniel, it's like, dang it, I didn't write that down fast enough. Yeah, just go to Conservation Nebraska. You'll either find you or they can email Conservation Nebraska and they'll get it to you, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Cool, cool.
Okay, we'll give a little bit more time if anybody has any more questions. But I'd just like to thank everyone for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. We're really glad that Bob was here tonight, and he's just a wealth of information, as you guys can tell. And it's always great to have him out.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And again, I apologize for not getting to the smaller trees and the shrubs, but there's always next time.
Yes, there is. You gotta thank you so much, Bob.
Awesome. You're
Okay.
welcome, Kate. Cool, cool. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed it and you got something out of there and you learned something about these trees that you didn't know before.